Hi, I'm Andrea. Welcome to today's Harper Lecture. The Harper Lecture series highlights the University of Chicago's collective commitment to the highest aspirations and standards in research and education. Today, you will hear from our world-class faculty and enjoy stimulating conversations on critical topics, all in the comfort of your home.
We extend our appreciation in advance to our global university community for their collective efforts in supporting the mission of the university in today's deeply challenging environment. Technology has allowed us to remain connected and engaged, and tonight, you too will be part of the conversations. A couple of notes. All participants will be muted. However, we do encourage you to ask questions. We will have plenty of time for questions at the end of the presentation. If you have issues with audio, you may want to shut down your programs running in the background or dial in from your phone.
Hi, I'm Colin. On behalf of everyone at the UChicago Alumni Office, we offer our deepest gratitude and appreciation for your continued support. We're proud to be part of this community as it has come together during these trying times to invest in our students, empower our faculty and scientists, and extend care and connection. And now it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 41st season of the University of Chicago's Harper Lecture Series. Thank you for being with us. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Harper Lecture. What do ACT scores and high school GPAs tell us about college readiness? With Dr. Elaine Allensworth. I'm Andrea Hodgman, Associate Director for Intellectual Engagement and Travel and the Program Manager for the Harper Lecture Series. On behalf of everyone at the UChicago Alumni Office, thank you for joining us. Please allow me to introduce our moderator. Dominque McKoy is the Associate Director of Engagement at the University of Chicago's To and Through project. In this role, Dom works across research, data, and professional learning to support high school and college completion efforts in Chicago and throughout the country. Dom most recently worked as the Director of School Partnerships at One Goal in Chicago. He holds a Master's degree of Arts in Public Policy from the University of Chicago's Harris School and a Bachelor's degree in Sociology and American Studies from Kenyon College. He currently serves on the board of Project 110, a Chicago-based mentoring program focused on supporting young men of color on their transition to high school. Dr. Allensworth and Dominque, thank you for joining us. Dom, I'll hand things over to you.
Thank you, Andrea. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dominque McKoy, and I want to thank you for joining us to hear from my colleague, Dr. Elaine Allensworth. For those who may not know, over the past few decades, Chicago Public Schools has made significant progress in increasing the rates of students who are graduating from high school and in the numbers of those graduates who are going on to obtain college degrees. While the bulk of this credit for these gains lies with students, families, and the educators of Chicago Public Schools, so the Chicago research community has also played a key role in this effort by helping our public education system hold up a mirror to identify needed areas of focus and to provide tools to help our system continually reimagine the ways in which we support young people along their education journeys. Dr. Elaine Allensworth has played a central role in this research to practice effort as the Lewis Sebring Director of the UChicago Consortium, where she's conducted research on educational policy and practice for the last 20 years. In this role, she works with policymakers and practitioners to connect research with on-the-ground practice here in Chicago and provides advice to researchers across the country about organizing research-informed improvement efforts. Her research on early indicators of high school success have played a central role in helping school communities across the country mitigate high school dropout rates and have helped to clarify opportunities to strengthen support of students along college pathways. She's one of the authors of the book, Organizing Schools for Improvement, Lessons from Chicago, which documents the ways in which organizational structures in schools influence improvements in student attainment. And Elaine has served as the principal investigator on research grants from funders such as the Institute of Education Sciences, the National Science Foundation, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I'm excited to introduce Elaine tonight to share more of her work here with the UChicago alumni community. Before I turn things over to Elaine, I do want to note and reiterate that we're going to try to hold ample time for questions from you all. So if you haven't seen already, just want to direct everyone's attention to the bottom of their screen. There's a Q&A button. As Elaine is presenting, please feel free to share your questions and we'll do our best to get to those before we close out. But with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Elaine Allensworth.
Thank you, Dom. Hello, everyone. It's good to be here. I really appreciate the invitation to be here today to talk to all of you about this research that I think is really critical for better supporting students to obtain their goals of getting a college degree. Thank you, Dom, for that great invitation, or that great introduction. I also want to thank my colleagues at the UChicago Consortium who've conducted the research that I'm going to be showing you together with me. It's been a journey that we've been engaged in with the Chicago Public Schools, where we've learned a lot, and we just keep learning more. This year has been really, really tough on everyone, but really everyone in schools, students and teachers and families. It's been so hard. One of the outcomes of the pandemic has been a reduction in the use of standardized tests in schools and in college admissions. So it's been this huge dramatic change from using tests extensively to suddenly not using standardized tests. Even before the pandemic, though, there was a trend for more and more colleges to make admissions test optionals, including University of Chicago. And people have very strong feelings about that on both sides. So when colleges don't use tests like they didn't last year, when they don't use tests like the SAT and the ACT, they rely more on students' high school grade point averages. So the average grades that students receive across all of their classes in high school, their GPA. I think we may be at a crossroads right now at the collegiate level, and also in elementary and secondary schools in terms of how we see and how we use standardized tests and course grades. So how do we know how well high schools are preparing students for college? And how do we know if students really are academically ready when they leave high school? High schools are set up to prepare students for college. Most states and districts set goals for college and career readiness for their high schools. Yet most schools and districts actually have no idea if what they're doing is successful, whether their students actually are obtaining college degrees or meaningful employment. One exception is Chicago, where the district has prioritized getting data on students. It works with researchers here at the University of Chicago, my colleagues, me, Dom, to produce data on graduation rates. And we follow students all the way from 9th grade through college graduation. And that's why I can do some rigorous tests of the beliefs that people have about standardized tests and GPAs and how they're related to success in college. Chicago gets data from the National Student Clearinghouse. National Student Clearinghouse gets data on college enrollment and college degree completion as part of the financial aid process. And so they share data with Chicago Public Schools, and that allows us to follow students to see if they enroll in college all across the country, no matter where they go, whether it's in Illinois or some other place. So that gives us a lot of really good data. For places that don't have access to the National Student Clearinghouse data, sometimes they will keep records of college acceptances, or maybe they'll try to survey students about what they did after high school, or they'll do like an exit questionnaire. But that's not really very good data. It's very biased. Students who are more successful are more likely to respond, and just because a student plans to go to college doesn't mean they actually enroll in college. So the most commonly used proxies that almost all districts use are standardized test scores. particularly the ACT or the SAT. These are the tests that are used for college admissions. And they're not just used for college admissions. Many states use the ACT or the SAT as their high school test for evaluating whether students are meeting their college-ready goals. They could use high school grade point averages because colleges use both in admissions, but that tends to be dismissed. I don't think, I say this knowing that everyone's probably saying, well, that's ridiculous, because people tend to say, well, there are different grading standards or grade inflation. And so people do not generally use GPAs as proxies for to evaluate how well schools are preparing students, even though they're used to evaluate how ready students are. Instead, there's just a very heavy reliance on test scores. And what people tend to look at is whether or not students are meeting these benchmark scores. Both the SAT and the ACT put out scores, and they say, for students who have the scores at that level, students are likely to be college ready. And they define that as having a 75% chance of getting a C or better in an entry-level college class. And then students who score below the benchmarks get messages that they need more work to be college ready. They're not there yet. So as a result, students and families and educators in schools spend a lot of time getting students ready to take these tests so they get strong scores, because college performance is so important. In fact, in one study, I found that it was common for schools to spend a month of instructional time just getting students ready for the ACT, doing a lot of test preparation. But the results are often really disappointing. Here's a headline, another drop in college readiness. In the report, it says only 37% of students who took the ACT met the benchmarks on just even 3 out of 4 of the tests. And if you dig deeper, you find that only 30% of test takers made all 4 benchmarks. Same thing with the SAT. In Illinois, where all students take the SAT, only 30% met the benchmarks in math. They don't report how many met it in both subjects, but it must be below 30%. And so we get these headlines that say, students are unprepared, and it's really distressing because 80% of students want to get at least a 4-year college degree. So students' college aspirations are up here, but yet only 30% of students actually meet those college benchmarks that say they're ready. So it's really distressing to a lot of people. But what if the tests don't actually tell us much about students' readiness for college? The test makers say that 75% of students at the benchmark get a C or better in a college class. But they don't say what percentage of students who don't make the benchmarks get a C or better in a college class. What if the probability of a C or better for students who don't make the benchmark is not all that different from students who do make the benchmark? Is the probability 0 or is it 70%? Feel free to try to Google the answer while I'm talking, but it's probably not going to be fruitful. It's not going to be a good use of your time because they don't publish that information. Okay. So Chicago became one of the first districts in the country to get accurate records on their graduates' post-secondary enrollment and degree completion through the National Student Clearinghouse data. One of my colleagues here at the Crown Family School, Melissa Roderick, worked very closely with district leadership in the Chicago Public Schools to make that happen, and other school districts have since followed. So having those data have allowed us to understand how high school factors actually matter for college outcomes, and then to study changes in college outcomes among students over time to see if more and more students are getting college degrees as the district has addressed various barriers for students. So Dom, who introduced me, works with the To and Through project, and they continuously provide data and research on college outcomes to the district. So when CPS first got those data, when the district first got those data, I started working with Melissa Roderick and other colleagues, Jenny Nagaoka, Vanessa Koka, and we were listening to the questions that were coming from folks in schools, and the questions tended to focus on enrollment in college. Were students enrolling in colleges? What kinds of colleges were students enrolling in? And that makes sense because for high schools, they wanted to know, were their students going to college? Personally, though, I felt like that was a secondary question. I felt like, enrollment is important, but first I want to know if students are actually graduating, because if students are enrolling, but then they're not getting degrees, then just focusing on enrollment is not enough. I wanted to know what actually mattered for graduating from college, and enrollment is one part of that. So that's what I took on in those early days. And not surprisingly, it turned out that students' academic qualifications at the end of high school were strongly related to whether or not they eventually graduated from college. Both GPAs and ACT scores showed relationships. Here's the chart from that early study. It shows college graduation rates by students' unweighted high school GPA. You can see there's a very strong relationship. Students with very high school GPAs, 3.6 or above, 75% of those students graduated, compared to 15% who had a 2.0 or less among students who enrolled in a four-year college. But when we dug deeper, we found that GPAs and ACT scores or test scores were not equivalent in terms of predicting who would succeed in college. So GPAs were strongly related to graduation, even when we compared students with the same test scores. GPAs provided much more information about whether or not students would graduate from college above and beyond their test scores. The same was not true for test scores. Once we started comparing graduation rates among students with the same GPAs, test scores didn't provide that much more information about who would graduate. So it seemed like test scores were related to college graduation, mostly because students with high test scores were more likely to have high grades. But it was grades that actually mattered, and grades are influenced by many factors. Test performance, yes, but also lots of other skills and habits. So ultimately, regardless of why students had high grades or low grades, it was their grades that really mattered for whether students would graduate. And it wasn't just our research. At the same time we were doing our study, there was another team of researchers who were using data from colleges, different sets of colleges around the country. They wrote up their findings in a book called Crossing the Finish Line. And they basically found the same thing that we did. So I spent a lot of time talking with folks in schools and with policymakers and other researchers about the importance of high school grades as indicators of whether students are prepared for college. And every single time I present this research, I always get the same question. The first question is always the same. You can probably guess what it is. Always. Wait, aren't grades subjective? I mean, the truth is they are. There is evidence. There's lots of evidence that it's harder to get good grades in some classes than others, and that teachers vary in their grading practices. So people are right. But the thing is, if grades are really, really unreliable, then they couldn't be predictive. They couldn't show any relationship with later outcomes. And yet they keep showing up as more predictive than any other factor that you can think of. So the counterpoint is always test scores are comparable. They have the same meaning regardless of where students attend high school. They are a neutral yardstick. I hear this all the time. But are they? Are they really? I mean, students do answer the same questions under the same conditions. But couldn't students prepare for the test in very different ways that have different implications for their success in college? Imagine two different scenarios, two different schools. One school where students spend all their time narrowly learning the topics tested on the ACT or the SAT, taking lots of practice tests, learning test-taking strategies. Then imagine another school where students get a broad curriculum, where there are high expectations around analysis, writing, discussion, opportunities for creativity. Two different schools. Both could be engaged in tasks that result in high test scores. But which is going to be better preparing students for college? Or think about parents that spend a lot of money on test coaching and test prep classes, where students are working on raising their test performance in ways that are completely divorced from what they're doing at school, right? So standardized tests might be a neutral yardstick of how well students take a test, but are they a neutral yardstick of how ready students are to succeed in college? So with my colleague, Callie Clark, I decided to see, well, how variable are high school GPAs as indicators of college readiness across high school? And so we asked this question, we said, okay, well, how different are college graduation rates for students with the same high school GPA? Do we find that a 3.0 GPA means something different in terms of readiness or academic preparation if you come from one high school versus another? And then let's ask the same thing about ACT scores, right? Let's put them under the same tests as we put GPAs under. And so we did that. And if we found that there are differences, there really could be two reasons why there are differences, right? So if we find that students with a 3.0 GPA are more likely to graduate at some schools than others, it could be because the relationship between GPAs and college graduation depends on what high school you go to. So maybe some schools have kind of lax grading standards, or they're just giving away A's. So there you wouldn't expect to see a relationship, right? While others, you might see a strong relationship. On the other hand, you could actually see that there's a strong relationship, the same relationship between grades and graduation at all schools, but that there's something about high schools beyond the grades that students get that matter for college graduation, right? So then the issue isn't that grades have a different meaning, it's that there's something about high schools that just aren't captured in grades and potentially also in ACT scores. Okay, so I'm going to show you what we found. Okay. There's a lot of lines on this slide. In this slide, each line represents a school, and it shows the percentage of students who graduated from each high school, who enrolled in a four-year college and then graduated within 6 years by their high school GPA. Okay, so each of these lines is a separate high school. Okay, and you can see students with high GPAs in general, on average, are more likely to graduate than students with low GPAs. And whenever we're looking at the relationship between GPAs or ACT scores and college graduation, we have to worry about spurious factors, things that actually might cause a relationship that aren't due to the student's level of academic preparation, like family finances. We know that families with more economic resources can support students, so it's easier to get strong grades in high school, and then those families also can provide more economic support for students when they're in college. So we might see that there's a relationship between grades and college outcomes just because both are related to family economic status. So we control for students' backgrounds in this model. We take out any kind of advantage that we see across all families that have certain levels of economic background. We control for lots of different background factors in here. Another concern is that GPAs and ACT scores are used in college admissions. And so it could be that having a high GPA or having a high ACT score means you're more likely to have access to a college that has a very supportive environment where you're more likely to graduate, right? And so it could be that, it looks like there's a relationship just because students with high ACT scores and GPAs are at college colleges where everyone is more likely to graduate. So we also take out those effects, right? And we compare students who are at similar, we do this in a few different ways, but generally we compare students who are at either similar colleges or the same colleges. So that, we take out any kind of benefits that we'd expect just because of which college you went to. So when we do that, this is what we get. And you do see that at every single high school, there is a strong relationship between students' grades and their likelihood of graduating. But you also see that it's absolutely true that a student, students who come from different high schools but have the same GPA have very different likelihoods of graduating depending on which high school they went to. Now, it turns out the slopes here, the relationship between GPA and college graduation by high school, the slopes do not vary significantly. Slopes are actually very consistent across high schools. So it's not that the relationship is different, it's that the intercept is different, right? So that all students at some schools are more likely to graduate than all students at other schools, right? At all of these different GPA points, right? There's something about the school that's not reflected in GPAs that matters for graduation. Okay, so now I'm going to push this over to the side, and I'm going to show you the same thing with ACT scores. Again, each line represents a high school. There's some high schools that don't have students at all ACT points, and so the lines end early. You can't really tell here, but also some schools don't have any students with very low ACT scores. So we only graph those points that actually exist in the school. The lines you can see are much flatter. Like after a while, there's basically no relationship once we get beyond like a 21 on the ACT. You may ask why none of these go up to 90%. I mean, how could students with ACT scores of 30 or plus be graduating at rates of 70%? Remember, I said we take out any kind of college effects that we see apply to all students regardless of their achievement. So it turns out that a lot of the relationship between ACT scores and college graduation occurs because of the colleges that students with high test scores attend. A lot of that relationship is just driven by where students with high ACT scores go to college, and they go to college is where all students are more likely to graduate. But compared to other students at the same college, students with higher test scores are not more likely to graduate than students with lower test scores. We do the same thing with GPAs, but we don't see that issue there, right? The GPAs matter, even among students at the same college. So the relationship is actually really shallow. It completely flattens out. It even goes negative, which we could talk about if you want to. But I have to speculate there. I have some ideas. Another thing is the relationship is not the same across high schools. The relationship between ACT scores and college graduation rate is not the same. So I'm going to just give you some numbers real quick. Straight correlations, both ACT scores and GPAs are correlated with college graduation. But once we compare students in similar colleges, the relationship between ACT scores and college graduation goes way down, right? That's why we see the relationship. Relationship with GPAs stays strong. Once we look at the relationship with ACT scores controlling for students' GPAs, there is no longer any added benefit of knowing students' ACT scores. Those slopes that we saw in the previous figure only occur because students with lower test scores also tend to have lower grades, but it's actually the grades that matter. When we compare students in the same high school, the relationship of GPA with college graduation actually goes up, and that's because there's a suppression effect. That it is absolutely true that it is harder to get high grades in a school with lots of high achieving students. So grades are somewhat suppressed. And so when we compare, when we look overall, the relationship is actually smaller than it is when we look among students in the same high school. And then the slopes are not the same. You know, ACT scores have a different relationship with college graduation, depending on which high school you go to, while the relationship of high school GPA with college graduation is consistent. And there are just these large high school effects. You know, I'm just going to go back here, you know, even, you know, among students with the exact same ACT score, it matters which high school you went to, right? There are just things about high schools that are not reflected in these measures of individual student achievement. Oh. Okay, so when I present these kinds of results, people always ask me, well, how can it be that grades are predictive, you know, if they depend on all of these different subjective factors, if they depend on which classes students take, who their peers are, which teachers they have, how can it possibly be that grades are more predictive than test scores when test scores, you know, are given in a consistent way across all students? So I'm going to try using the sports analogy. Hopefully it will work. I just want you to imagine that you are a coach for a football team, high school football team. And just think about this for a second. How are you going to choose your members and for your team? Are you going to choose them based just on how fast they run 100 meters? Because, you know, running time is a uniform measure. It's related to overall performance. In football, it can be measured in pretty much the same way across all contexts. So it's uniform. It's a neutral yardstick. Other measures of players' performance, passing, blocking, scoring, persistence, sportsmanship, they depend on who else is on the team, opponents, conditions of the field, the quality of coaching, subjective perceptions, right? Those are all, you know, variable and subjective. So should you rely just on running speed, the neutral indicator, to choose your team? Of course not. Right. And so grades provide this, you know, they're based on all of these different factors that are variable, but together, you know, looking across all those students' classes, you know, they provide us, you know, in order to get good grades, you have to show lots of different skills over a, you know, extended period of time and in lots of different subjects. And so you just get much more comprehensive information. But right now we're in this system where basically, you know, if you were a coach, think about if you were judged not on, you know, your wins, but how fast your players could run 100 meters, right? That's our situation right now in schools. If you were a coach and you were just kind of judged on how fast your players could run 100 meters, you probably stop spending so much, you know, you'd probably end up having them spend a lot of time running. And in the end, that probably wouldn't make them better football players, right? Because they're just spending all their time running. And that's what we see in schools. You know, schools tend to narrow the curriculum down to just tested subjects and just, you know, and then ask students to do work that's similar to, you know, preparing for the tests. You know, and you think about the messages that students are getting. You know, can you imagine telling a student, oh, you're not ready to play sports yet because you can't run 100 meters in under 12 seconds, right? You're not there yet, right? Think about the messages that students are getting on these indicators that actually are, you know, measure one small component of what matters for college. I worry about this because one thing that we know about from research is that mindsets, students' perceptions of whether they can succeed, whether they belong, those are really powerful in terms of student motivation. So if a student, you know, feels like, you know, they can succeed, they can do it, they really belong here, when things get tough, they're going to persist, right? But if you're doubting yourself, saying, oh, can I really do this? Am I going to succeed? Do I really belong? then when things get hard, it kind of seems like confirmation, maybe I don't really belong here, right? Maybe I can't do this. And so it can undermine students' success. So we're giving these messages to students that don't meet these benchmarks, you're not ready yet, even though the tests do not provide very strong evidence of whether they're ready or not. So should we worry that more and more colleges are going test optional? I mean, it'll probably mean that they're making better decisions about who's likely to succeed. College and career demand all sorts of knowledge and skills from students. Course grades are not perfect. There are issues with course grades too, but they're a much more comprehensive picture of what students can do across all subjects, meeting lots of different kinds of assignments and showing persistence across an entire semester or school year. They also allow students to show success in different ways. So, working to improve students' grades also means building all those different skills and all that different knowledge, and that actually leads to higher learning gains and higher test scores, but it also ultimately leads to greater success in college and in life. So we're at a crossroads right now in how we use grades and how we use standardized tests. And I do think it's time we shift the narrative away from what we've been doing without a lot of evidence, and we make decisions based on evidence about what students actually need to succeed in college and career. And I'll turn it over to Dom now.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you to everyone who shared questions. Please feel free to keep those questions coming in. To start us off though, Elaine, we've gotten a lot of questions just around some of the analysis and some of the decisions of the team. Could you provide a little bit of context around why the team used ACTs versus SATs, unweighted GPAs versus GPAs, a little bit more context about Chicago?
Yeah, definitely. I'd be happy to. So at the time that we did the study, ACT was the test that was taken by all 11th graders in Illinois. And so we had ACT scores for all students that went through 11th grade in the Chicago public schools. So it's this complete population of students that we could study. Now students are taking SAT. So in the future, we'll do research on the SAT. They are very highly correlated with each other. And there, other folks who have done research, I mentioned the book Crossing the Finish Line. There are a couple other studies. They've looked at both ACT scores and SAT scores, and they've also found that grades are much more predictive than SAT scores as well as ACT scores. Unweighted GPAs. This is one of my pet peeves. People will all the time they'll cite some research and they'll say, oh, the relationship of GPAs is not that much strong with college outcomes. It's not that much stronger than the relationship with test scores. Invariably, when they do that, first of all, they haven't looked within high schools or within colleges, but they almost always use either weighted GPAs or students' self-reported GPAs. So high school GPAs, the actual grades students get, A, B, C, D, Fs, those are very strongly related to how students do in college. The specific classes that students take in high school show much weaker relationships with performance in college, right? It's not as much what you take, but how well you do in the classes that you take, right? Are you developing those, those study habits and learning strategies and knowledge and skills? That's what matters. So when you combine, so weighted GPA basically combines a really strong metric with a really weak metric, right? And when you do that, you get something that's in between, right? So weighted GPAs are less strongly related to students' graduation than their unweighted GPAs. And students' self-reported GPAs are also less strongly related than their actual GPAs.
Appreciate it. Also had a couple of questions. You talked a lot about the characteristics characteristics that are predictive of students' college success. But could you talk a little bit more about the characteristics of colleges and what we've learned about colleges that have been supporting student success as well?
Yeah, so, one of the things we looked at in the study was, we included a whole bunch of different college characteristics to try to make sure we're taking out any potential effects of colleges. But in doing that, we also saw the college characteristics that showed relationships. And there are relationships with things like college size. Students are more likely to graduate at smaller colleges, colleges with larger faculty to student ratio. But by far, the college characteristic that is most related to students' graduation was the institutional graduation rate of the college. So we used the institutional college as the variable that we used was the institutional graduation rate of the college for students in the same racial ethnic group of the student, right? And we used it from the year that the student would be applying to the college, right? So our students were not included in the calculation of the institutional graduation rate. We looked at what was reported by the college in the year that students would be applying to college. If that makes sense, right? So if you looked right now to see, where would I be most likely to graduate? You would want to use the institutional graduation rate that's already been reported, right? And then of course, most of the students that are used to calculate those rates are not students from Chicago. They're from all over the country. But we wanted to know, what should you be looking at if you're looking for where you're most likely to succeed? It's whether or not it's the institutional graduation rate, which kind of makes sense. If other students are likely to graduate there, you're more likely to graduate there.
We've also had a couple questions about these relationships with community colleges or two-year college outcomes. Could you talk a little bit about the work that's happened around understanding some of these relationships with two-year outcomes and what we've seen?
Yeah, so this work only looked at four-year college outcomes. We've only recently started doing research that really looks closely at two-year college outcomes. And that was partly because it's very hard for us to interpret outcomes for two-year colleges. So when a student enrolls in a two-year college, we don't know, are they intending to transfer to a four-year college, to get a two-year associate's degree, to get a certificate? So it's really hard to know what is that outcome. Recently, we now have a data sharing agreement with the city colleges of Chicago. And so we're starting to do much more research looking at two-year college outcomes.
There's a flood of questions dropping in here, so I'm doing my best to keep up. A couple people noted that a lot of this analysis relies on the National Student Clearinghouse data that's provided. And from a policy perspective, there's some questions to know, do you see any opportunities? What other opportunities do you think may exist for kind of that core data to be better shared across schools, to kind of democratize some of this data to support students?
Yeah, because right now, districts have to pay for it. We have all these. All of our school systems, are set up to prepare students for college and career. Pretty much every state has, standards that are intended to, prepare students for college and career. We should be looking at the outcomes as to whether or not students are actually succeeding. Otherwise, I feel like people are just working blind, right? And right now we're relying on these proxy indicators. We're relying so much on, ACT and SAT scores, or other exam scores, PARCC scores. These scores are not yet. I think people believe that they're highly predictive of how students will do in college, so they think that they're getting good information. But the fact is, they're not getting good information. So we're relying on these proxies that don't actually tell us how students are doing. And then what happens is people start focusing on trying to improve test performance, and they actually can undermine students' readiness for college and career. And there are also big equity issues here too, because there are really, very strong correlations between average school test scores and the economic backgrounds of families at a school. The correlation is 0.7. It's so strong that I can't enter both variables into my models at, as a school level variable, because they cancel each other out. And so when we're looking at average test scores as indicators of school quality, we'll end up labeling schools that are serving affluent families as strong schools, even though we don't know if they're actually adding value to students' outcomes, and then labeling schools serving students from less affluent families as not good schools when they actually might be doing a really good job with students. And so, and then that then feeds into people's perceptions of their schools and the perceptions of themselves, and then patterns in terms of where people go to school. I do think we need to take a close look at what we actually are using in terms of indicators of school quality.
So a lot of folks are interested on your policy takes. So we can dive into a couple of those. Part of the reason why we're here tonight talking about this topic is that, you mentioned this yourself, this conversation of schools going test blind or test optional is really prominent, partly because of the circumstances of these past years. As you're watching this play out, what do you think it'll kind of take to see, or what do you think colleges kind of need to learn to start kind of seeing more schools kind of take this leap of going test optional?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of colleges already know this, honestly. They do their own institutional research. And I think one of the reasons a lot of colleges have decided to go test optional is because they see that the test scores don't provide very much information about how students will do. I do think there's a lot of pressure, though, from outside organizations to use tests in admissions decisions. So, colleges get ranked by, the incoming test scores of their students. And so there's this pressure to look high in the ranks to use the test scores for admissions decisions. I think, I think that's a problem. So I don't necessarily think that the colleges would want it if it wasn't affecting how they looked externally. In terms of schools, I think we are also, might be at a turning point in elementary and high schools too. We've had this year where, we've gone from having, in Chicago at least, students take lots of standardized tests for lots of different purposes. And this past year, they stopped taking the standardized tests. The Biden administration has said, okay, students will take tests again this spring. In Illinois, students are taking, the state test. Students in Chicago will take the state test, but a lot of the other tests are not being given. I think, this could be a time for people to really reevaluate, and think about what are the tests that are being given. A lot of the tests are very highly correlated with each other. It takes a lot of instructional time to prepare for tests, to take tests. It's very stressful for students. And so really thinking about what is the value that we're getting from all of the different tests, and how many tests are really needed. I think those are conversations that people are having now. And I think really understanding what it is that the tests are telling us could make a big difference in those conversations.
So to put your creative hat on a little bit, we had a question here that I want to pose. Folks are asking if you imagine you were the director of admissions at a school, and how would you go about kind of taking some of this research, trying to put it into practice?
Yeah. I don't know, could I resist that external pressure to make college look good? I might get fired, I don't know. Yeah, I think I do think, obviously, we have a lot of colleges that are going test optional. So, you always want to think about, who is most likely to succeed here? Who is going to need supports? I think there's a lot of times assumptions that students who have high test scores are going to succeed, but actually, one of the reasons I think we might see those declining graduation rates for students with the really high test scores is that I think they're going into very difficult programs based on the assumption that they'll do well, when it's actually students' grades that are a better indicator of whether they're ready for more rigorous programs. And so really, I think taking a second look at the data, say who actually needs support here, and also who's most likely to be successful. There's so many things that actually are affected by test scores, from financial aid to, admission to different programs. And they really do serve as a barrier for a lot of students. And there are equity issues because test scores are related to race, ethnicity, economic status, and again, families with more resources, they're putting those resources in to making sure students have high test scores that might not even though translate into whether the students are most likely to succeed. And it's certainly other families do not have those resources to put into that. So, grades also are affected by, by lots of factors like, resources. But again, test scores are they're so narrow that they're much more easy to manipulate. So.
Appreciate that. So a couple other questions. We talked a lot about test scores relationship with college graduation, but there's been a couple questions about the relationship with college enrollment. Can you talk a little bit about other metrics that were kind of tested throughout your research and what we've seen there?
Yeah, actually, if you go through our paper, we also look at the relationship of test score, ACT scores and GPAs with college enrollment and enrollment in colleges with stronger institutional graduation rates. And their ACT scores and GPAs are pretty much even. So, colleges are definitely using both, and they're using both fairly equally, right, in terms of admission decisions. So, having stronger test scores, can get you into a stronger college. It just doesn't mean that you're necessarily as likely to succeed there. And again, if you're a coach of a football team, are you going to equally weight how fast someone can run with all of those other subjective factors? You probably would be making better decisions and really finding students who are more likely to succeed if you just focused on their grades.
It's a great question here about, what do you think this data means for students, right? Students that have come across this, that are interested in applying to college, that are still, subject to some of these constraints, but, what are some of the takeaways?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say, just because your test scores are not at the benchmark levels, you can still succeed, right? I do worry about these negative messages that students get to say, not ready yet. And then, they're going off to college, with these kind of messages when, for a lot of these tests, the difference really is, for a typical student, the difference in the probability of a C or better really could be 70% versus 75% if you're at the benchmark and you're college ready. The difference, it depends on the test and depends, exactly what your score is, but the differences aren't so great. And so I think I would say, take your test as one piece of information that's not nearly as important as your grades. Working hard in your classes, learning lots of different skills, meeting different challenges from different teachers, over a long period of time. That's what you need to do to succeed in college, right? And so, For people who are working with students, what I would really like to see happen is for people to really look at students' grades and recognize, okay, if students are going to be succeeding in college, they really should be getting A's and B's in high school. If they're not getting A's and B's, we need to understand what's happening. Like, what do students need to succeed? Grades actually are, something you can do something about. Like if students, there are many reasons students might not be getting strong grades. Some students are, encountering barriers. If they could, address those barriers, they can really start to engage. Some students need learning strategies. They need to figure out, how to do high school, figure out habits. There are also differences, like we'll see students, they'll move from 8th grade to 9th grade and their grades will drop. And it's not because they've changed, it's because the structures of school have changed. Or we'll look at the school and we'll see, the same students are maybe getting A's and B's in math, and they're getting B's and C's, the exact same students in English, because people aren't paying attention to, the factors that are influencing students' grades. So I think there's a lot that we could do to really think about how we support students so that they're getting stronger grades, because that means actually they're more engaged in their classes, they're putting more work in, they're learning more skills, and then they're going to be better ready for college.
So, a few people have pointed out that we've talked, primarily, obviously this analysis is done in Chicago, but thinking about even outside of the country and around the world, are there any other systems that in other countries that you look at when you're seeing how they select students and admit students, support students to college, that you think we can learn some lessons from?
Oh, great question. I'm not aware of any. I think standardized tests are used extensively in many places. Mm-hmm. So it would be a big shift to change things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, kind of on that note then, there's another question here of, do you think that standardized, so we know that they're not predictive of college graduation for students in Chicago. Mm-hmm. Do you think that they could be designed better to be more predictive?
No. So
say more about that.
Just over and over again, people will find problems with a test, a standardized test, and they'll say, they'll decide, no, that's a bad test. So we'll come in with a new test. This is going to be a better test. And then that new test is exactly the same as the old test. And this happens over and over and over again. I mean, right now, I just think of the millions and millions of dollars that were spent to develop tests for the Common Core state standards, the PARC and the Smarter Balance, or is that the Margarine, Smart Balance? Anyway, there's these tests that were, designed millions of dollars. They're super highly correlated with, the other tests that are given. It's not clear that you're getting something new from all these different tests. It's just that people have to get used to a whole new test. And I'm not saying that tests give you no information, just like, it's not like you get no information from seeing how fast someone can run. You do get information. It just doesn't tell us all the things that I think people think that they tell us.
There's a lot of curiosity. So, been doing this work over, a number of years. What do you think are still the big questions for you, for the consortium, that you think will kind of continue to help us provide tools to better support students?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I would like to look into are those giant high school effects I showed you. I don't know if you remember the figures, whether you look at students with the same GPA or the same ACT, or you look at both simultaneously, there are very large differences in college graduation rates based on which school students attended. So I think understanding those is really, really important, because I think that could give us a clue about structures that matter and also about school practices that matter.
So we are coming up on time. I apologize to everyone. We got almost over 70 questions, so we're not able to get to all of them, but I appreciate everyone's effort. Elaine, I mean, we are kind of coming up on time. I kind of want to just think about kind of any final thoughts. I think pushes, I think we definitely have folks who are paying close attention to your presentation, but kind of synthesize some of those takeaways that you want people to be leaving with.
Yeah, I think just start questioning when people start raising alarms about, oh, students aren't ready based on standardized tests. Start asking questions. Do we really, are these tests really telling us what they think they are? Let's start thinking about what are the consequences for students and how do we best support students so they can reach their potential.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you so much. I think that is about all the time we have for questions. So with that, I will pass it back to Andrea.
Thank you, Dr. Allensworth, for sharing your knowledge and insight with us. It's really fascinating. And thank you, Dom, for being here to moderate. You can read more about the work of the consortium by visiting their website, consortium.uchicago.edu. If you'd like to hear more from Dr. Allensworth, you can listen to the UChicago Big Brains podcast, episode 46, How Students and Schools Can Recover from Coronavirus, where she discusses what students have lost during school closures and how schools can aid them in their return. So visit bigbrains.uchicago.edu. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you soon.